Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Aaron Striegel, who is a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Notre Dame. Professor Striegel's research interests focus on instrumenting the wireless network ecosystem to gain insight with respect to user behavior and optimizing network performance. Flagship projects of Professor Striegel include the NetSense, NetHealth, and the Tesserae project, involving the instrumentation and analysis of data from hundreds of smartphones and wearables over a nearly 7-year period of continuous data streaming. Welcome, Aaron.
Good to see you, Gil.
So I want to start with the Tesserae project. And this is a large-scale longitudinal in situ multimodal sensing of information. And you investigate how a suite of sensors can measure workplace performance, such as organizational citizenship behavior, psychological traits such as personality and affect, and physical characteristics, sleep, activity, and so on, over 1 year. And so you enrolled 757 information workers across the US, and even measured heart rate, physical activity, sleep, social context, and other aspects. And you use smartwatches, phone agents, beacons, and social media. So this was really collecting information over a long period of time. You're really sort of looking at the process of doing that, right?
Yeah, so the broader goal is that this was a federally funded study, and the issue the particular set of agencies was having is primarily with regards to just generally trying to better understand workplace performance. And there was sort of a widespread acknowledgement. I think most people have probably done the yearly performance reviews or maybe even quarterly, where you sit down, you kind of go through your, how have you performed this year for the purposes of promotions or raises. And there's sort of largely an acknowledgement that this isn't the best process. And so the kind of the crux of this funded effort was to see, have things like wearables, smartphones, social media, and all of the work that's sort of been bubbling up in the literature. Could we take these kind of various sensing streams and could we fuse them together, bring together their multiple modalities then to try to better understand job performance and the various aspects that kind of fit into it? Could we do better than kind of what has been espoused in the literature?
Right.
Could we gain new insight? And so the crux of this study then is what we did, and this was a joint effort across a whole slew of university partners, is that we tried to enroll a large number of information workers then and study them over a year-long period, and look at things how like maybe life events or just sort of the general cadence during a year. Could we predict daily job performance or just general trends, and what kind of insight could we gain with that? And it's, as you can imagine, it's sort of an incredibly complex suite of data, but the end goal was trying to figure out what sense could we gain? What kind of insight could we gain, and how could that be useful potentially to an organization?
Yeah, so it seems like there are two things there, right? One is in a study like this, one of the issues obviously is the privacy and security of data and how receptive people are to sort of sign on to a study like this. And so you're sort of exploring that also, right? There are some incentives and things like that you explored here, or that's a different study?
So we, yeah, so we didn't necessarily explore the specific incentive levels. We had a couple of different approaches to that, but first and sort of fundamental as part of the study is we really put security and thinking about the privacy as sort of a fundamental, sort of non-negotiable characteristic of the study,
Yeah.
because there are legitimate concerns. When I go to work, do I want to be instrumented as a requirement for my employment? And I think the sort of resounding answer for most people is no. And so when we had launched this study, any sort of human subjects work is going to have a review by what's called an institutional review board to
Mm.
approve it. But we had been very careful to be very upfront. So as part of our study, you have a standard sort of informed consent, which explains here's the benefits, here's the risks of participating in the study. From a risk standpoint, there really aren't medical risks, but there are definitively always, some privacy risks, which we tried to minimize or try to design in sort of security underneath in terms of how we would de-identify data and how we would aggregate it. But there's a very broad sense in terms of understanding what are you contributing. So we actually set up our study where not only would we get you to provide informed consent, we actually provided an overview for each of the sensors that we did. And we had our people enrolling in our study actually affirm that they're like, I'm okay with sharing this particular set of data. And then we make sure to also, as part of our study, de-identify as early as we can in the pipeline. We have a very particular security structure in terms of how data flows into our back end, how we protect the data in terms of restrictions to access, sort of best practices from security with regards to aspects such as two-factor authentication, how the data is actually stored, how we sort of silo any sort of information that maps back a participant to that. So again, we sort of de-identify it as early as we can, such that the data isn't sitting with any sort of identifiable information in its final state. And so that's kind of one of my other hats is I do a little bit of security work. And so we're always very concerned on that. But at the end of the day, it still is a very valid concern, because do I want people to have this information? And the hope with this study is as well to kind of provide insight of what actually helps, what provides insight on it. If I have data like location, is it actually useful, or does it just seem like it might be useful, but maybe doesn't really contribute that well to understanding my job performance? What parts, what sensing streams might help best? And that's one of the things we've also looked at as part of the study, and sort of trying to understand what data might be useful towards the overall goal of better understanding job performance.
Okay, okay. So Aaron, the infrastructure itself, could you talk a bit about it? So there is a wearable device, there is a phone agent that's running in the background, there's some static Bluetooth beacons, and then there's social media data, right? Because this could have applications potentially, right, for other use cases too, such as health, home health, those types of things. So could you talk a little bit about the infrastructure that you use for it?
Sure. So I would definitely agree that there's much broader implications than just potentially job performance. So we had a large sort of set of university partners. So we brought in experts. We had Gloria Mark from University of California, Irvine, Andrew Campbell from Dartmouth, Anin Day from the University of Washington, Moon Chaudhuri from Georgia Tech, Sydney DeMello from UC Boulder, and Nitesh Chawla from Notre Dame. And so we had all these experts together who understood a lot of these sensing streams and how to analyze the data. So that helped us kind of understand, what are the capabilities of these sensors when we were trying to set up the study. And so we had a couple of when we sort of designed this study to think about, number one was we wanted these sensors to really be unobtrusive, and we didn't want people to feel like they were in a study.
Yeah.
So, we were intentionally biased towards consumer wearables because we need you to wear these for the whole year. We want you to largely use these things and sort of forget
Mm.
about it. And so that meant we needed long battery life. So you didn't have to constantly be charging the
Right.
device. It needed to kind of run in the background, and then a lot of it to sort of set it and forget it. So for the wearable, which is kind of the centerpiece, if you will, because that provides sort of all of your physical activity signals, so things like sleep, heart rate, all of those sorts of things. We use the Garmin Vivo Smart 3. We had a great relationship with
Mm.
Garmin that helped us get that all going. The nice part about that is it gave us 5 days of battery life. It was waterproof, so you didn't have to worry about it. If you wore it in the shower, you could charge it pretty quick every morning and have it basically never run out of battery.
Mm.
So that provided a lot of kind of our physiological signals.
Yeah.
We leveraged there was a great phone agent that Andrew's group out of Dartmouth had built called Student Life.
Mm.
So we kind of augmented that, and that fed in data, some additional data from the wearable, as well as data from our beacons. And that was kind of a longitudinal app running in the background. Now, there's always challenges with Apple and Google, and they have a fundamental tension with privacy, so they really don't like your app running longitudinally like that. So we had kind of
Yeah.
special mechanisms and sort of a non-app store distribution, of course, with full permissions and full signing to do this.
Mm.
But we kind of had this where that would longitudinally log things like location, because we were interested in, did location actually help? And so if we didn't gather it, we couldn't necessarily assess it. And then things like, when was your phone on? When was it off? We didn't look at actually any phone usage, like what were you doing on your phone? We were more concerned on, were you turning on your phone? Maybe were you using your phone before you went to bed?
Right.
And then just generally kind of, where did you go in terms of a normal cadence of a day, or if you were traveling for work, kind of looking at sort of, what's normal and what's a little bit different to provide context. And so then kind of one of the more important pieces of context then would be these Bluetooth
Mm.
beacons. And so these are we got these from a particular company called Gimbal. And the nice part about those is they're very privacy sensitive. So they use some interesting cryptography underneath, such that you just can't scan and find these beacons. You have to be actually part of the ecosystem underneath.
Mm.
And we ended up passing out 4 beacons. So we gave our participant 2 static beacons. These were relatively reasonable range beacons. And we asked them to put one at home and one at work. And again, the idea with those is, I don't really necessarily need to know your
Yeah.
location, but it would be really great if I knew you were at work or at home,
Right.
especially because this is related to performance. So could I use these beacons and not track your location? And so the idea was you would just kind of put these in a drawer at work or at home. And then we also asked them to carry these kind of 2 small kind of key fob like
Yeah.
beacons. And these are, just the size of a quarter. Put it on your keychain or close to just on a set of keys, or maybe in a suitcase or something you might take to work. And the idea there is, it kind of is on you. And then what we're looking for is, are you interacting with other people in the study at work? And that has a whole slew of how do you get enough people at a workplace to do that. But we were sort of looking at like coincidental contact at work. If you're a manager, do you go and see people at their desk, or do you just, how often do maybe you meet in the hallway? Now, the big caveat on that is that only works if both people are enrolled in the study. If you're not in the study, you're effectively invisible. And so we passed out those. And then the final sort of stream that we brought in was social media. And social media is, it received a considerable amount of publicity. And so Moon's work out of Georgia Tech is phenomenal. She's done a lot of work looking at sort of mental health, depression, just generally sort of interpreting social media. And the thinking is could we take in aspects such as like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and how could that maybe provide us some insight, particularly about mood or life events that were going on,
Yeah.
to help sort of understand, again, context. The main thing remembering with social media is it's not a continuous sensor. It's whenever you feel like you want to post. then there'd be information that we might be able to glean from that, whereas our wearable and our phone agent are kind of gathering data continuously. And so the idea then is, can I fuse this all together to help me make better sense? So you might be stressed and maybe you posted something on social media, the wearable says your heart rate or your heart rate variability has changed. And then maybe social media helps us understand a little bit more about what might be stressing you.
Right.
And a key thing to remember on social media is we've effectively de-identified it. So you can reduce it down to just larger characteristics and sentiment. So we're not necessarily sharing or any sort of, what is the exact post. What we're looking at is extracting certain keywords that help us understand sentiment. So like maybe you were sick or I'm excited, and those kind of words and how they might map to emotion as opposed to just logging all of the social media underneath.
Yeah. When I read this, Aaron, I kept thinking about other use cases, especially in healthcare. As you know, in the context of COVID-19, the latest statistic I saw was about 10% of the country has some level of depression currently. And, I don't know how long this is going to last and what the long-term implications are. But presumably we are getting into a regime where, a lot of people could have health-related issues, not only tactically, but more long-term, right? So this might have some applications there too.
Definitely. And Moon's group has looked at a lot of kind of just general, particularly with students thinking about mental health and depression and how that might manifest itself in social media. One of the challenges, of course, is kind of, there's been more skepticism towards social media. And so we saw that even during our study where Facebook had the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and that actually had a real chilling effect in terms of how people use social media. And we saw that in all of our data. And so that's a challenge as well, because again, social media is kind of, are you choosing to post it? And so what we found is there were some of our users who are very prolific, generally younger, who did a lot of social media, and that was great. But there was also, since we had a pretty healthy age range in our study, there was a healthy number that largely just kind of lurked or observed on social media. And so there wasn't really a rich data stream. And so there's always a challenge on this. And I think there's a lot of really kind of fascinating work with regards to wearables and phone usage and trying to figure out, and coupled with social media, to better understand mental health, because some of the biomarkers that we get from a wearable are really useful from a just sort of an acute stress standpoint where, my heart rate has changed just now. But understanding things that are more chronic or perhaps that are trends over time, those are more difficult, to get at, and trying to design studies to kind of get at that particular pieces of information is challenging. There's been a lot of interesting work that's kind of bubbled up in the wearable space, particularly with regards to just outright detecting COVID symptoms, generally things like respiration rate and some of that. But the mental health side, that's still it's a real challenge. And there's a lot of kind of exciting research trying to kind of divine or discern that. And it's challenging because many of the signals are really weak.
Right.
And so trying to figure out what was real versus what was noise. And then in particular, how do you get at a ground truth is hard. And so bringing that all together is that there's a lot of kind of really fascinating research challenges, and there's a lot of really, really intelligent people in the research community trying to discern, what could we plausibly try to learn from these, and what could we gain, that might be actionable, that would be able to sort of, what's that signal in the noise.
Right. And you found some differences in compliance rates, right? Whether you enroll them remotely or face-to-face. And I guess they had to respond to a survey on some regular frequency. So what did you find from a compliance perspective? What was the difference face-to-face enrollment and remote?
Yeah, so one of the challenges is, when you try to do these studies, as an academic or just generally for looking at these sorts of things, is how do you try to scale these sort of
Yeah.
studies? We had 757, which is just a gigantic number when you're actually sharing wearables and all of this sort of everything was study provided. So to provide a little bit of context, we had kind of two groups that we had enrolled people in, but our goal was 750. We'd done 750 with a past student study,
Mm.
and we felt we could get 750 information workers, which are not on campus, which is a challenge. And then we would provide them wearables, the beacons, and they would elect to share their data with us. And so how we set up the study is that you would get paid $750 over the course of the
Mm.
study, which seems amazing and incredible. That was tempered with the fact that these were information workers, so these were white collar workers that, already earned a pretty good salary. And so that sort of compensation was intentionally designed to not sort of, make them jump at the study and take unnecessary risk, but sort of tempering it with their existing salary levels. And because we were asking them to do a lot of stuff over a whole
Yeah.
year, and these are kind of very, very busy people. So a question that emerges from that is, if I'm going to spend this much money to try to do these sort of studies, how can I better understand compliance? Because this is expensive,
Mm.
and so can I understand early on who's likely to be compliant with the study, with the caveats being is, you don't just want to have wholly compliant people in your study uh, if that skews
Yes.
your demographics. So, if you only get conscientious people in your study, but you need to study a broader population to be able to generalize your findings, it does you no
Mm.
good. And so we had when we set up our study, every people would enroll. Generally speaking, we had worked with various employers to kind of advertise via word of mouth. They might have seen their friends participate in the study. We used a LinkedIn and some various other mechanisms to kind of to get that. But we had kind of our first kind of three cohorts that we enrolled, which was about 300 people. We enrolled them all in person. So we either went to their place of work and we had a bank of 8 laptops. So to take the initial survey,
Yeah.
and then we kind of helped them face to face in terms of those sorts of things. Or, and then we switched over and we did remote. And this remote one was we would send you the parts for the study,
Mm.
and then as we send you the parts for the study, then we'd ask you to kind of get it all working. And then once you got it all working, then we would have somebody basically make sure, it's all working, make sure you took the survey all right. And so it was a little bit not that face-to-face interaction that you might have with somebody in terms of getting set up. And so we were kind of curious to see, would you get similar compliance for the if you were enrolled remotely where we never saw you face to face versus if we saw you in person.
Yeah.
And so kind of, the interesting sort of things, if you will, in terms of compliance is we looked at how much of the variance in compliance could we predict? Could we do things like personality?
Mm.
Could we do things like how well you did on your surveys, maybe during the first couple weeks? So, would that be predictive of how you're going to fare over the whole
Mm.
year? And so what we find generally is, folks who are a little bit older um, tend to fare a little bit better. Folks, of course, who are conscientious fare a little bit better. But we could predict roughly up to 40% of the variance, kind of within the first 2 weeks of the study. And the paper sort of walked through, what generally, if you were trying to design a study and maybe trying to kind of minimize the number of people who would drop out or just be non-compliant, or are there certain characteristics maybe you could pick up on early on to do a better job? And it was, not 40% of the variance is pretty good,
Mm.
and these are lessons that somebody could take, who would be designing a larger scale study like this, or maybe even for, say, an employer, that might want to offer, say, Fitbits or say Garmin devices. If you wear this Garmin or Fitbit
Yeah.
to try to improve your health, I'll give you $100 off your health insurance
Right.
for the year, trying to kind of predict who might fare a bit better on that. And so there's some interesting things. Generally speaking, the first 2 weeks are strongly indicative of how it's going to fare overall.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, for our study, you have to add in the caveat that you had to complete this initial survey, and then we would poke you once a day,
Mm.
roughly about a 2-minute survey to kind of ask you how you were feeling that day, things like mood or productivity, just once per day. We tried to keep it relatively benign, but then we still asked you to keep the phone agent running and wear the wearable, and all of those things would sort of fit into compliance in a broader
Mm.
sense.
Yeah, again, I see other use cases here are, clinical trials, for example. If you can predict compliance behavior using early data, first couple of weeks of data, that has a lot of implications for clinical trials as well. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely. And there's a healthy body of literature, on the medical side that tries to look at this, from primarily a clinical trial perspective. But there's some interesting things in terms of maybe app interactions or sort of more digital ways to do that don't require the provider to be seeing the person every day that could be helpful.
right, right. Yeah, I want to jump into another paper which was done little while ago, but it has increasing relevance. Face-to-face proximity estimation using Bluetooth on smartphones. And you say the availability of always-on communications has tremendous implications for how people interact socially. In particular, sociologists are interested in the question of such pervasive access increases or decreases face-to-face interactions. So you're trying to measure in a population how frequently they interact face-to-face, right? And that distance, that face-to-face interaction distance varies based on the environment and so on. So could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So this actually came out of our NetSense study, and kind of, or sorry, our NetSense and our NetHealth study. And the issue we were looking at there was, and as you said, it's highly relevant now, is we were working with sociologists, David Haken and Omar Lizardo at Notre Dame, and what we were trying to understand is, how do students make and keep friends? And in sociology, we'd refer to these as ties.
Yeah.
And so we're interested in, when students come to campus, Notre Dame draws from a very broad cross section of individuals across the country. So most of the students don't know each other before they show up, and so we're interested in, okay, these freshmen come to campus. When do they make their friendships, and then how do they sort of persist over the next 4 years? And so NetSense had kind of looked at just using a smartphone, and then NetHealth, we added in a wearable on top of it. But the issue is, I can poll you and I can ask you and say, like, who are you friends with? And that's okay. But I probably can't do that every day,
Mhm.
even every week or even every month is too much. And so we were using Bluetooth, which has received a lot of attention with the digital contact tracing out there. And so we had looked at what we wanted to understand is Bluetooth can do a pretty good job, at the time, that would look at, like, are you in the same room? And so that paper had explored what we wanted to understand was, you know, could we know when you were in close proximity versus just in the same room? So the existing work at the time had largely focused on, did I detect a Bluetooth signal?
Yeah.
And the problem you would have with that is you couldn't really discern, were you in the same room or within 6 feet, which of course is the sort of, distance that's widely accepted now for COVID
Right.
detection. And so we'd gone through and we'd measured various things around campus, trying to figure out distance, like if you were sitting at a table, how far was it, and just watching students and observing. And we did a healthy amount of testing looking at, could you use the Bluetooth signal strength then to then try to figure out, are you in close proximity? And there's something called RSSI,
Yeah.
which is Received Signal Strength Indicator, and that's been used, pretty broadly in terms of triangulation. So if you look at cell phone tower geolocation, Wi-Fi, often you'll see systems using that, but their accuracy is not enough. And so we were interested in, if I look at pairwise, looking at either phone detecting each other, could they pick that up? Now, again, the caveat I have to add with all of this is that if both of the people are not running the same app or study, you can't just go around randomly scanning people and doing that. They all have to sort of participate or opt
Yeah.
in. Otherwise, I can't just pick you up. And so this paper looked at, how accurate could I be? And what we found is, in this case, it was Bluetooth Classic, which was not necessarily the beacons that you would see nowadays, is that if you were within 2 meters of each other, we could do a pretty good job of discerning 2 meters or less or greater, and we could do a pretty good job in terms of location up to 2 meters.
But
Once you got more than 2 meters out,
does it depend
it was
whether
rough.
you're indoors or outdoors, Aaron?
It does somewhat. The 2 meters was pretty solid for both indoors and outdoors. When you're outdoors, it's actually a little bit more helpful. So what happens indoors is you get what's called multipathing effects, where your signal might go out and it bounces off the concrete and comes back. And there's various things underneath how you can kind of discern the time of arrival, angle of arrival, but you can't get that unless you're sort of at the really lowest layer. A phone's not going to give you that. But generally speaking, if you're outdoors, the signal decays more rapidly because you don't get that multipathing, whereas indoors, it's a little bit better. But we were primarily concerned with indoors because we were interested in, are you sitting in the classroom together? Are you walking to class together? Those are the things. And we did, as part of like one of our later studies, looking at like, could I detect who your friendship group is by who you go to eat at with the dining hall? And then that has some implications for like understanding, dining hall design. And then of course, all of these sorts of things have incredible relevance now for COVID, right? Because, I'm interested in that 6 feet. That's the sweet spot where it really works. From a digital contact tracing perspective, it could be very powerful. But the flip side is there's a lot of caveats, both with respect to privacy as well as to accuracy, the relevance for digital contact tracing. So it could be helpful, but I think the important part to remember on all of those is it's a tool to help out, not a replacement. And like there's been efforts by like the government in Singapore, they built a trace together. You have the Apple and Google efforts going on that are all really relevant to that, again, to come up with another tool to help in the fight against COVID.
Yeah, it's interesting, Aaron. Apple just came out with an update to the operating system. They have built into the operating system some sort of a notification for COVID infection. So you don't have to actually download an app. It is in the operating system itself now. And so, I don't know exactly how it works. It's probably based on self-reporting or some other database, essentially giving you a notification that you are in close proximity to an infection. Now, that coupled with your ability to understand, how close you are to an individual, could be quite useful, right? For instance, I don't know what the privacy and security implications of this is, but you could imagine a situation where the phone vibrates or gives an alert if you are close to an infected individual, for example. I don't know if it is even possible.
So this is one of the real challenges, and I know there was a lot of kind of discussions in kind of March, April, and May about how to do this in a privacy sensitive manner. Because imagine, if there's somebody who's COVID infected and your phone buzzes and tells you they're COVID infected, but there's only one other person standing around you. That's not great, right? Because you're like, okay, I know you have COVID. So generally how it works is what they do is they basically turn your phone into a beacon, and your phone is chirping, but it's doing this in a manner that has cryptography built into it. And so your phone then can listen in to these advertisements. These advertisements, they do some tricks with what's called the MAC address or the identifier. So you can't really map it back to a specific piece of hardware. And then using some very clever cryptography, you basically can query and say, here's the people, here's the cryptographically secret pieces of information that I've seen over the day. That's shared with the database overall, but I can go and basically then I can query and say, are any of these cryptographically secret ones, did any of them have COVID?
Right.
And so then your phone every once in a while goes out and it checks to see, and then you have a public health authority that's involved that provides kind of here's the people who had COVID.
Mm.
And then again, there's some cryptography magic that goes on in the middle that then sort of marks it, if you will. So it's very intentionally designed such that you can't know who had COVID. Now, there are certain cases, edge cases, where it breaks down. Let's suppose, you're only at home
Yeah.
and your spouse gets COVID and they're the only person your phone has seen. There's some edge cases where it breaks down, but generally speaking, if you interact, with 100 or 200 people in a day, you're not going to be able to discern who amongst that had COVID. And that's very intentional in their design, because there's a lot of privacy concerns, because while this can be very useful from a COVID perspective, the concern is this could easily be flipped over to become a surveillance tool.
Right.
And that's from an authoritarian or just civil liberties perspective, there's a lot of concern on that. And we actually have an ongoing effort, I myself and a colleague, looking at, how do you kind of minimize the amount of information leakage for some of these edge cases and only expose the bare minimum to be useful? Because, what's your end goal? Your end goal is, if you were exposed, to get you to go take a COVID test.
Right.
To get checked up on that, or to potentially to isolate a little bit early. But kind of the delta or the value add of the trade-off of privacy of, should you do that in the next 10 minutes or should you do it within the next few hours? It's trying to balance that privacy versus speed,
right,
on that. And then, not revealing, who has COVID. Part of that is this could be very sensitive information. And so being very mindful of how do you protect that. And again, there's a lot of really smart people who do some really fantastic work with regards to how can you securely share the information without revealing it and still keep it robust from potential bad actors. There's a lot of wicked awesome work that's in the area too.
Yeah, and not to be too pessimistic about it, COVID-19 is one shock, and maybe there's COVID-20 behind it. And so, it might be that we are into a position that requires this type of thing, not just for 1 year, 2 years, but, perhaps forever. And so, a lot of questions around regulation and policy choices there.
Yeah, and I think there's some interesting things too, particularly, if you look at the wearable space, are some of these wearables potentially early warning sensors?
Yeah.
Looking at you look at like the influenza like symptom network that sort of tripped a bit early in New York. Understanding better how we sort of synthesize some of those medical records, and maybe coupled with some wearable data. And as we start to network, some of the hospital data, and try to figure out how to kind of silo and share it appropriately, I think some of our capacity to better detect it, for better or for worse, COVID-19 has shown a lot of the shortcomings in our current system. And so hopefully there'll be some streamlining to better be able to kind of detect these sorts of things. And I think perhaps thinking about where we need more people watching, and sort of paying attention, because at the end of the day, machine learning and AI is fabulous, but a lot of times you still need a domain expert to kind of really distill that signal from noise and ask yourself if it makes sense. And, hopefully this kind of exposes some of the weaknesses in our system to help us better design things moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Something good will come out of it. I want to jump into another paper you have. And again, I find a lot of different use cases for this. On the interplay between individuals' evolving interaction patterns and traits in dynamic multiplex social networks. You want to describe a little bit about it? So this is, you have individual traits, and generally speaking, people tend to gravitate toward others. They form networks. those networks, in a dynamic sense, could have some effect on the individual, and individual is shaping those networks as well, right? So studying that over time from a network perspective appears very interesting.
Yeah, so this is a really fascinating question from a sociological phenomenon. And so this was work that I'd done jointly with Tiana Milenkovic. We had co-advised one of my students, Lei Meng and Yuri Holatve. They had looked at this, and this took our NetSense and our NetHealth data.
Yeah.
And what we were interested with this is because we had network data, both reported kind of via social networks. We extracted network data via text messages, sort of who were you texting, as well as via Bluetooth. What we were trying to look at is, if I look at a network, there's different ways I can explore it. One way is to look at sort of global network alignment,
Right.
which is trying to figure out, how do my links and edges, how do I preserve this at a very high level? So, kind of try to maximize the overlap and preserve some of the patterns. And then other ways to look at it is to try to align it on a more local level. So if you think about sort of what's called graph isomorphism, and thinking about, are certain triangles or hourglass shapes preserved, and then trying to kind of maximize that on a very small scale. Because at a high level, these networks are big. Now, in our case, it was, again, roughly about 700 plus individuals that we looked at for some of these. And so, but even then, to kind of compute and do all of this, it's potentially an n cubed or n to the fourth sort of thing. So it's very costly to try to do these sort of alignments. But what we were looking at is, from a sociological phenomenon, there's something called homophily, which is, if you think about, do I get drawn to kind of the mean of the, characteristics? So maybe I don't stay up late, but all my friends stay up late. Do I stay friends with them, or do I stay up late too? Or do I make them all go to bed earlier, which probably for college kids is probably not happening. But there's this notion of sort of this network effect. And so we looked at things like BMI and looking at various aspects of personality. And the interesting part on this is we were able to validate some of the findings, looking not only drawing from NetHealth, but also drawing from, there was an existing study by Sandy Pentland out of MIT called the reality mining study. And so we were able to look at these network effects, and really interesting, again, how you talked about, how do they evolve? How does my friendship evolve from semester to semester to semester, and these sort of, how do I model, how do I capture it, and how do I analyze it? And looking at various aspects of the networks themselves. So things looking at like centrality or different sort of aspects of the graphs themselves, like degree or density, which ones are helpful. Looking at these sorts of things. So kind of in some sense, sort of a North Star, if you will, in terms of how might I look about these networks. And it's a fascinating way to look at these sort of this network analysis phenomenon in terms of kind of, and again, relevant again from a COVID perspective. If you think about all of the bubbles, that's talked about, have your local bubble, and how do you have bubbles that interact with bubbles, and looking at those sort of transitivity effects. There's a lot of interesting things, I think, ways to study problems. And in particular, that work really evolved from a lot of work studying biological phenomenon and looking at gene expressions, things like aging, and taking some of those same tools and then trying to apply them to different domains is, it's a really kind of intriguing way to look at things.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, So you are looking at how individuals gravitate towards certain networks, and then those networks are clustered in some ways, right? So, I was thinking that, let's say you have a measurement that says XYZ is in this cluster in this network, and that would be your expectation of that individual. And if you see a drift in that individual, moving to another network, moving to another cluster, again, that could imply something, right, about that individual. Perhaps it's something to do with health, perhaps it's to do something with mental health. and things like that. Is that possible?
Yeah, and that's definitely, if you look at some of the work looking at like social networking,
Yeah,
and some of that takes some of those same concepts to try to extract things like depression.
yeah,
So, if I can study things like social withdrawal, looking at the number of interactions and changes, and the kind of the trick or the hard part, if you will, is each person is a bit individually different.
mm,
So understanding for, say, you, Gil, what would be the change that matters versus the change for myself, that threshold might be different. And it might be a function of maybe, how extroverted I am, maybe my job role, and kind of discerning what's a meaningful change for you.
right,
And then, discerning, because oftentimes there's a lot of changes, there's just fundamental to a network, but then discerning what's meaningful and then what's actionable. And then a question is sort of, how early could I see it? And then how confident could I be that that result is actionable to allow me to, do something, to intervene
right,
on it? Or maybe is it more broadly useful from maybe a population standpoint? So maybe, I'm interested in a metric for campus population that might say, okay, my students are more stressed. I need to do more interventions for counseling, maybe more awareness or looking at these sorts of things. Maybe it's just a broader organizational trend as opposed to an individual interaction.
right.
But there's a lot of really, really cool work that's going on in the community trying to make sense of this, and ultimately, could I intervene earlier, if you're suffering from depression, or these sorts of things, or get you that help that you need, on that is, incredibly useful, especially in these times.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And to your point, it may not be an individual intervention. It could be a network intervention, possibly, right? So you could conceivably, Aaron, I'm just speculating here, attach a transmission index or
Hmm.
transmissibility index to a network. It might be based on the characteristics of the individuals that form that network or that cluster. And so, if that transmissibility index is beyond certain threshold, perhaps you can intervene on the network somehow to reduce
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. You might look at it. So, like for example, one of the things our student athletes had done at Notre Dame was they set up these kind of town halls to talk about mental health awareness,
Yeah.
and having some of the more senior athletes come out and say, I suffered from these particular issues, related to anxiety, stress, or pressure, and being really kind of forthcoming about that. You can look at it, not only have I detected that maybe you as an individual have moved this way or this group has changed, but maybe there might be obstacles in terms of pursuing mental health, that I might make someone, I wouldn't say quite more susceptible, but make them perhaps more amenable to going out and seeking that sort of assistance as well.
Mm-hmm.
And are there ways to kind of, from an organizational perspective, you can think about this, whether it's an institution like Notre Dame or it's a large employer, looking at how are ways that maybe I can better gain some insight, again, in terms of, at an organizational level, what are the trends, and how can I maybe steer them towards more desirable outcomes, just to improve the health and well-being of my employees, which I think most organizations realize is absolutely essential to their success.
Right. Right. Yeah. So in conclusion, Aaron, if you take these three papers that we discussed, what could we do in this COVID-19 context, more tactically, next year or so, that could make things better? People talk about herd immunity and those types of things. I don't think we are really measuring disease burden very well. We know what's happening in the very short run. We have no idea what's going to happen in the long run. So the disease burden that we anticipate could be substantially underestimated. Um,
Hmm.
and so, if reducing infection is still the objective function, what could we do in the next 6 months, 1 year to improve it?
So I think one of the particularly salient points we could look at is understanding people's perception of risk and their risk amenability. So I think one of the, if you look at some of the modeling efforts, and again, I'm not an epidemiologist, so, I'll add in those caveats, but understanding modeling, gravitating, thinking about super spreader events,
Yeah.
thinking about people's propensity to go and be at a super spreader event, and understanding that kind of mindset with regards to contact tracing, or I think people's attitudes towards, understanding how do I improve adoption of things like mask wearing, or, how can I make people aware of understanding the risk of different activities. I think that's been probably for an individual one of the more frustrating points, is understanding what can I do, how can I understand, is it red, yellow, green,
Yeah.
which activities are most risky versus which activities, are just fine, and I think, a lot of that has evolved as our understanding of COVID has evolved. But if we have new emerging infectious diseases, is understanding, what is risky or what is not, in a way to kind of track that. Digital contact tracing cuts a little bit at that. That's
Right.
primarily oriented at, did I come in contact with somebody who, potentially had COVID? But what if you think more broadly and you think about who are the people that I were in contact with and how risky was their behavior?
Right.
Because if you think about how bubbles work and those sorts of things, what the bubble is trying to do is that you're trying to keep the people in your nearby circle all effectively with manageable risk. But anybody they interact with, you're sharing that risk. And so understanding, I think, in a broad sense, both people's attitudes, as well as, is there a way to sort of visualize or better comprehend those sorts of things? I think that's a really missing piece,
Yeah.
that we don't have a lot of data on that. And I think that there's a real, potential to kind of fill in some of that, but it's difficult data to get at, difficult data to kind of understand, and a lot of it kind of can be cut to a lot of this proximity and interaction and understanding that, and that's a real challenge. But I think there's a lot of opportunities in that space that would really help inform our understanding and decision making.
Yeah, yeah. Almost everything that we do today is sort of looking back, right? So I think, what you are also getting into is, can we predict something? Can we predict the risk of getting infected, the risk of transmitting? It's a multifactorial analysis. Individual traits go into it. Their state goes into it. And so there is some predictability there. Now, obviously, that gets into privacy concerns. Maybe it's not individual interventions. Maybe it is network sort of customized interventions one could do, right?
Yeah, or even think, go a little bit crazier and think about, could I look at, trying to limit interactions, or at least I don't know if I'd call it manipulate them, but, imagine a system where it tells you, hey, if you go to the grocery store from 9 to 10, this is the lowest risk time to do that, or trying to balance maybe how you might report this information. We've seen that kind of like, grocery stores will say, okay, from 8 to 9 in the morning, these are oriented at people who are in the high risk category,
Yeah.
to try to limit exposure. Are there ways to look at this more broadly? Maybe drawing on particular patterns or these sorts of things that, again, can just inform, because, I don't necessarily want to be fully tracked, but, if some of this data is aggregated, could it better inform my decisions as an individual, to help reduce that overall sort of risk, and potential when we have that human to human transmission and these sorts of things, and are there ways to kind of more broadly, look at health related to this? And there's a lot of just kind of broader system dynamics, whether you look at just general sort of areas of development or general city planning and those sorts of things. There's a lot of analogs of how can the data, help better inform us to make those particular decisions. And, a lot of it boils down to networks and understanding interactions.
Right. Excellent. Yeah. Thanks so much for this. And thanks for spending time with me. And good luck with all this research that you're doing in this area.
Thank you very much, Gil. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.